I'm Denny Royal, and today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about life-centered design and the capabilities that you need in order to do that sort of work. So I'll get right into it. I'm going to talk about it at a high level, but before we get too deep into it, it's kind of some truth time, right? We are in trouble. The planet's in trouble. As a species, we're in trouble, and it's become painfully obvious now. And unfortunately, in our arrogance, we're taking a bunch of other species with us and starting to render large swaths of the planet uninhabitable for us and uninhabitable for those that we share it with. So we're hitting multiple major tipping points when we start to think about this. Some examples of this, some visible examples that we're all seeing now is the Thwaites ice shelf, for instance. Most likely will splinter apart in the next decade and allow the acceleration of the ice field that's behind it to flow into the ocean and melt. And just the loss of the Thwaites Glacier alone will probably cause about a 65 centimeter sea level rise. If it destabilizes the whole West Antarctic shelf, and that ice sheet, that would cause about 3.2 meters of sea level rise. So to put that into perspective, that event alone could put over 120 million homes globally underneath the high tide line. So that's not even taking into account the ice that's melting in other places like Greenland or the Arctic ice shelf as a for instance. Other things that we're seeing, more 1,000-year weather events are happening, more intense hurricanes that gain strength much quicker, more 1,000-year floods globally. Here in Bulgaria, we saw it this summer, and we saw it in the United States this summer as well. So in the United States, we had 6 1,000-year weather events within 8 days over the summer. So that's a lot that's going on. And one more thing that we're seeing, in the US, Europe, Siberia, Australia, all have seen the frequency, intensity, and scale of fires increase. And what's really scary is this is happening at a rate that was unexpected by scientists, and it's kind of starting to freak them out because they didn't anticipate it to happen with this much intensity. And this is just signs of things to come. So when we think about this, this problem is more important than any other problem that our species faces. So beyond inflation, beyond anything like that, this problem lasts 1,000 years, and it pales in comparison to all other things. So if we don't work on this, there's going to be more famine, there's going to be more war, there's going to be more vector-based diseases, more refugees wandering the planet, kind of looking for places to live because their homes no longer exist or their area is no longer inhabitable. So we've crossed this threshold where sustainability is no longer an option and kind of shouldn't even really be a topic anymore. The climate has changed, and it will continue to change. The feedback loops are already in motion, and it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better in all probability. So we need to figure out how to adapt to what that reality looks like, that climate reality looks like, and how we're going to survive in that. So to give you an example, 99% of all species that have ever inhabited the planet went extinct because they were maladapted. So if we think that we're outside of that math, we're horribly mistaken, right? We can't beat the numbers, we can't beat the math on that. So we've got a choice. Can we be maladapted, or do we want to be well adapted? And that choice is ours to make, and we need to think about that as we move forward. So as designers, we have a huge part to play in this, and we can use our roles to influence kind of what that adaptation to the new world actually looks like. So I believe that we can do this through life-centered design. And when I think about life-centered design, it's a combination of some core things that go into that. So there's a design thinking component to it. There's biomimicry, there's behavior design, and systems thinking. And I'll dip into each of these a little bit deeper. So, designers are very much familiar with the design thinking part of it, and most of our audience, I'm sure, is very familiar with design thinking. But there's one kind of slight twist when we start to think about that. We need to move away from human-centered design into this life-centered design requires a shift in thinking. And what I mean by that is we need to not just be gaining empathy for humans alone, we have to be gaining empathy for all the other species and not just paying attention to our unmet needs, because quite frankly, a lot of our needs are dependent on the rest of the environment around us, so we have to pay attention to those species. We have to pay attention to what we are doing because we're subject to all those same laws of nature. We are a part of nature. So as we adapt, we have to fit in better, or our issues are going to continue to grow. So when we think about that, just think about like the empathy gathering piece of it in a very different way than we have in the past. And in order to do that and move that direction, we have to have that, like I said, we have to have that deeper empathy for other species, and that really requires us to quiet our cleverness. So slow down, think about it a little bit differently, put ourselves back into that childlike mind, embrace our curiosity. We're a very young species comparatively on the planet. So we really haven't been here that long, and there's a ton that we can learn from everything that's ever happened before us when we think about that time scale, right? And that's where biomimicry comes in then. So the whole concept of biomimicry then is to look to nature to help solve those design problems. And when we think about that, when we think about solving problems, where do our ideas really come from? And all of us are like, well, it comes out of our brains and, all those little neurons firing in there. We think it's a human process, and we believe, that we can be creative on demand. And sometimes we can, but there's limits to that. We have some of that capability, but those limitations really start to close in on us. If you think about it, whenever anybody steps to the whiteboard to start to concept on how to solve these problems, we're really only bringing our lived experience as individuals and kind of our known little tiny library of things that we've done in our past. So, when there's 4 or 5 designers standing in front of a whiteboard, how much knowledge are we really bringing to bear on that? And, I believe that actually that innovation is one of the oldest processes in the world, and that we can look outside of just what we have in our minds. So for instance, life is 3.8 billion years old, and it's been innovating ever since, it first formed out of bacteria in the primordial soup. So when you think about that, like, what does that mean, right? What does 3.8 billion years of innovation start to look like? So here's a thought exercise, right? Let's compress the entire existence of the planet into the time frame of 1 year. So think about it like this. January 1st, the planet's born, okay? Earth is born. That's 4.5 billion years ago. So the planet's been around for that long. And then think about that, we've just ticked past New Year's, right? So we don't see life until February 25th. So up until now, it's been this like primordial soup. So life shows up 3.8 billion years ago, and it shows up in the form of cyanobacteria that form these funky little things that you're looking at here, known as stromatolites. And basically, life's been colonizing the planet ever since. So life equals that first innovation, and for the first month of life, that's kind of really all there is this bacteria. And with that, CO2 levels are continuing to rise on the planet and grow because these organisms are producing a bunch of CO2. The next innovation then, 1 month later, is when photosynthesis shows up. So we start to see this like rapid conversion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the sequestration of that. It's starting to sequester that, and the production of oxygen is starting to happen. Another really cool thing is that we start, as there's photosynthesis, suddenly life has the ability to produce energy from sunlight, and that really changes the rules of the game for life on the planet and what's about to come next. For all of April, May, June, July, there's only single-celled organisms living on the planet. So the next innovation then was multicellular organisms, and that happened on August 16th. September 17th, so a whole nother month goes away, sex happens. And when sexual reproduction begins, that's when things really start to change on the planet. You start mixing other ideas together. This whole idea of mixing DNA and recombinant possibilities that are starting to happen with that, that's the beginning of exponential growth and exponential innovation that starts to happen. And you really start to see a growth and diversity of species. We start to get out of these kind of more cellular organisms and into stuff that are more complex and multicellular organisms in really amazing ways, and amazing things start to happen. So innovation really begins to ramp up at an exponential rate. November 15th, fungi show up. They're one of the older kingdoms in the world, and we're really just now starting to understand kind of what fungi do and how integral they are to all the other innovation that happened, and how important that functional mycorrhizal network is. And we'll get into that a little bit later. November 20th, 5 days later, then the first vertebrates show up. So the first vertebrates show up, and it's in the form of fish, and the colonization of the ocean starts to begin. A couple days later, land plants begin to emerge. Fungi had set the stage, and like I said a minute ago, there's a very symbiotic relationship between most plants and the mycorrhizal network, and those exchange of nutrients were really important in the way that life started to colonize what was going on, and started to colonize terra firma and kind of get out of that primordial soup and get out of those other things, right? November 24th, insects show up. That's really starting to create this interesting space for innovation. So innovations like wings, legs, the ability to walk. Insects are the first ones that started to have these things. It's also super interesting that insects actually have much, much more biomass and make up actually the most biomass on the planet. As an example, ants as a species have more biomass than Homo sapiens sapiens. So if you took all the human beings in the world and all the ants in the world, the pile of ants are going to be way bigger than the pile of humans. And it's super interesting because you never see any waste from the ants, right? You very rarely see the ants, but there's a whole lot more of them than there are of us. December 2nd, amphibians show up. They need moisture. They actually preceded reptiles. They showed up before reptiles did, and they were kind of, dipping out of the water for short periods of time, leaving it, and then going back into the water. December 6th, then, reptiles actually show up. So they've been around since then, and they came out of that amphibians that were finally able to adapt and to go out and stay on land for kind of infinity and not have to be in the water all the time. Mammals have only been here since December 13th. So we're almost all the way through the year already, and we're just starting to see the first mammals show up in this time scale. So birds have only been around since December 18th. You might be surprised about this one. Flowers don't actually show up until December 20th. They've only been around for 11 days. The explosion of innovation that happened with flowers in that last 11 days is really quite incredible. But the reason is that a lot of flowers have a commensal relationship with a particular kind of beetle species, and that allowed there to be like lots of commensal things happening in this evolutionary process to create all these flowers. December 25th was a really shitty day for the dinosaurs. An asteroid hit the planet at about 6:30 p.m. and they go extinct. But that was only 6 days ago on our timeline. So it's getting really, really tight. So now let's fast forward to hominids, the first two-legged species to walk upright. When do you think they showed up? Well, 11:30 a.m. That was about 12 and a half hours ago. So our ancestors, not even us, not even Homo sapiens sapiens, our ancestors have only been here for 12 and a half hours. So how long do you think we've been here? How long can we lay claim to the planet as Homo sapiens sapiens? Not very long, about 24 minutes. So 11:36 p.m. was when we showed up. And think about all the wonderful, wonderful things humans have done since we showed up. Now, think about agriculture, right? So humans are walking around the planet. Think about agriculture, and that is really when everything changed for humans, because we suddenly went from hunter-gatherer to staying in place and being able to innovate and have time to think and do all these other things versus figuring out where our next meal is going to come from. So how long ago did agriculture happen? 1 minute. So 10,000 years ago in this timeline was only 1 minute ago. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, the last 200, 250 years or so, where we as humans really think that all of our innovation has come from, all the stuff that we've been able to do with that innovation, coal, burning oil, our brains, machines, computers, technology, where we get all of our answers for innovation and all the answers for living on the planet, how long do you think that was? Not even a full second. So when we think about that, have we really reached the pinnacle of innovation in that kind of 1 second ago mindset? I don't believe that we have, and I think we've got a lot to learn yet. So only 1 second of that existence is where we kind of rely on all of our innovation work to come from. And we as designers, we're all being asked to solve bigger problems all the time, and we're being asked to create solutions for the future. So we like to think that we've accomplished quite a bit, but we could look to nature and kind of learn to live differently. What would that start to look like? So what if we took and looked at that 3.8 billion years of innovation that's all around us, that library that is right outside of our door, and we embrace that wisdom? Could we actually learn something? How might our innovations be different and our solutions start to be well adapted versus maladapted? And that's where biomimicry comes in, that biomimicry thinking. So for us, it's a lens, it's a framework, it's a way of doing innovation a little bit differently, and it's a way of doing innovation that fits a little bit better with the planet and allows us to fit in and adapt and kind of be here for a little bit longer, hopefully. So this library for innovation, like I said, it's right outside of our doors. And imagine if we started asking those questions of the natural world, what would nature do, or how would nature solve this? That's really what biomimicry is all about. So when you think about this left side of biomimicry and nature and life, combined with the right side of like design, innovation, and technology, that section in the middle is really where that innovation starts to happen. And that's that intersection is what we like to talk about. And again, we think about it as a discipline, we think about it as a practice, and we think about it as a way forward. So it's the practice of looking at nature, at the natural world, to kind of help us with those design challenges. And I think about it like that library that we can turn to, again, versus what we've got in our minds when the 4 or 5 designers step up to the whiteboard, versus this vast library that, again, is outside of our door and has been happening for about 3.8 billion years. So when we think about that, it's about form, process, and ecosystem. So a lot of the work that we do is about form and shape and what that starts to look like, but it goes beyond that to look at processes and ecosystems as well. So this example with the honeybees, for instance. So this form of the hexagon is one of the strongest forms that there is. It is one of the most optimal forms for packing the most stuff into a small amount of space. What's really cool too is this honeycomb is what we would call additive manufacturing versus subtractive manufacturing. So if you think about how we make parts today, usually we take a big block of something and we cut it all up and carve it out, and there's a whole bunch of waste left, versus additive manufacturing, think 3D printing, right? That's what's going on here, and that's how the honeybees kind of start to build their thing. We also look at ecosystems. So another example with the bees is we might look at the ecosystem of the hive, for instance, and most people don't know this, but the queen isn't really the boss. She's a baby making machine, and that's really kind of it. And she doesn't make any decisions. They make decisions actually as a democracy and a quorum. There's kind of a voting process that goes on with any of the decisions. The other thing that's kind of cool with bees and their ecosystem is that actually it's not just you're a drone, you're a worker, you're a scout. Every bee can actually do every job in the hive, and they work their way through the ranks, and they have those different jobs at different periods in their lifetime. So super different and super interesting with what's going on with that ecosystem. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how we might translate that into our world in design, right? So one really famous example is the Shinkansen bullet train. And this train travels at 200 plus miles an hour. And every time it would go through a tunnel in Japan, there'd be this loud sonic boom when it was coming out of the tunnel. And that made all the neighbors in the neighborhood of those tunnels not very happy at all, right? Think about if you lived next to that thing and it was making this boom every few hours, you would not like that either. So they were tasked, the engineers that run the Shinkansen bullet train were tasked with coming up with a new train or somehow figuring out how to make things quieter. And one of the engineers was an avid birder. And he started to think about some of the birds that he'd seen, and one in particular came to mind, the kingfisher. So the kingfisher has the ability to go from air into water and get their fish and not make a splash. So it's one fluid medium to another fluid medium and creates no splash. And the way that it does that is actually with the shape of its head. So they abstracted that design principle, looked at what that bird's head shape was like, and pulled that into their design process as they started to design the train. So ended up with it. It very much looks like the front of a kingfisher now. What's really cool, doesn't make the sonic boom anymore. It uses 15% less electricity than it used to, and it's now 10% faster. So really interesting solve. Quieter train, more speed, less energy. Another example from the software world, the next time you're driving around your car and you drive through a forest, go ahead and thank the trees that are outside your window for actually helping with your car's safety and gas mileage. So there's a company called Klaus Maddock, and they developed a piece of software known as SoftKill. And what that software does is looks at where materials actually needed. So they looked at human bones and they looked at trees. So material is super, super expensive in nature. It takes a lot of calories to build material, so shape becomes everything. So they looked at how trees, if you look at where a branch connects to the main body of a tree, you'll see more material there and it's laid up in a different way than maybe less material on the top of that branch. And that's really optimal for using that material. So they built this software that you can feed any part into. So if you're designing a car, you're in your Pro E system, you can put that part inside of this software and it'll look for the optimal material layup based on kind of thinking like nature and putting that material only where it's needed. So it optimizes the strength with the minimal amount of material. So what we see in a lot of parts is up to a 30% less weight, right? So it's much more optimal in the amount of material and weighs much less, which allows our cars to be more fuel efficient as well as being stronger and more safe. And the last example I'll talk about is EvoLogix. So EvoLogix is a company that also does some software, detection software for tsunamis, particularly in the Ring of Fire. And detecting tsunamis is pretty hard, but one of the major problems they had with, they could put these detectors down in the ocean and they would be like 6,000 meters deep, but the detectors then had to transmit a signal up out of the water to be able to use radio frequencies then to communicate back to land to let people know that the tsunami was happening. And water is very, very, very hard to transmit a radio signal through. But what was really interesting is dolphins actually do this. So dolphin signature whistles, they can communicate with each other and know which individual it is and what they're saying to each other up to 25 kilometers away. And the way that they do this is by transmitting several frequencies inside of each transmission and modulate them in a really interesting way that allows it to project through that water medium. So EvoLogix studied that and really pulled apart what was going on and how the dolphins were doing their frequency and signal modulation and ended up being able to solve that problem. So now it's deployed all over and we can transmit that stuff through the water and allow folks to know early if there are tsunamis headed their way. So that's enough about the kind of biomimicry component of it. The next one I want to talk about is behavior design. And behavior design is, it's a little bit more well-known than the biomimicry piece of doing life-centered design. And I'm not going to go super deep into it, but here's the thing with behavior design. I think design thinking does a really good job of defining that unmet need. It does a really good job of letting us understand the people that have those unmet needs. But it doesn't really tell us what they're doing and why they're doing it and what's going on in their heads. So usually, as designers, we tend to design for what we'd like people to do. And sometimes that's successful, sometimes it's not successful. So if you actually look at the behavior and you start to design around what people are actually really going to do, based on human behavior and certain biases and heuristics and how human beings actually interact with each other and start to point towards how they're really going to behave, you're going to have a lot more success with your designs. And by doing that behavior design work, it starts to allow us to understand what those behavioral targets should be with any interaction and really set you up for a better impact and better success with that sort of stuff. And then the last piece that goes into this is systems thinking. And system thinking can be super complex. There's multiple systems, especially when we're talking about the environment and the climate. There's multiple systems interacting with each other, multiple ecosystems interacting with each other. There's these transition zones that are going on, multiple feedback loops, and finding the right point in the system where we can kind of intervene and influence it, it's critical, especially when we're talking about the environment and climate change. So kind of couple that with human behavior and what we like to do with that with systems and thinking about where can we leverage a system starts to get really interesting, right? So currently when we think about any kind of change in a system, we think kind of down here on the bottom of this diagram, right? Kind of all the way to the far left, we think in numbers. We think about how can we reduce carbon by X amount? And that's really not getting a lot of leverage on the system. And once in a while we bounce out a little bit more up the scale here to the right into these kind of behavioral patterns, but usually it's just in those two things. Where you really get leverage is far out here on the right all the way up to the 12th one when you start to think about changing the paradigm around what's going on. And a really good example of that, for instance, the paradigm of growth for the sake of growth. Right? When we think about our economies, when we think about all the stuff that we're doing, it's growth, 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 growth. And, is that really sustainable? What does that start to look like when we think about the climate and the environment? And until we start to kind of shift those paradigms, we're not going to have the impact that's probably needed, the political will or any of that stuff to have that impact that's really needed, that's really going to start to make change when we think about the climate. But here's the deal, is our reality needs to change. And unfortunately, the reality is changing around us as we speak. So our new paradigm becomes one of adaptation, and that becomes our new reality. And we will have to deal with that. And we'll have to think about, other places that we can leverage in these systems. So that's kind of the main thing I wanted to touch on with the systems thinking piece. Kind of to wrap it all up. So again, life-centered design, it uses design thinking to identify that unmet need of the people that have that need and what we're trying to do, but also the other species that are around us and what they need so that we can all live together. Biomimicry, think about that as that library of potential solutions that we can tap into. Also using it as a standard to measure against, are we doing well? Are we fitting in? Are we well adapted and fitting into the environment in the way that we need to be? And then behavior design to really understand, what people are doing and how to try to influence them in a better way. And then systems thinking to kind of tie it all together and understand the broader systems and the impacts and the leverage points that we have within them. So through this methodology, we can design much more well-adapted solutions, and it'll allow us to live better on the planet and create conditions that are much more conducive to life. Couple places to check out to get some deeper information around this. So Biomimicry 3.8 offers a bunch of different levels of training. Highly recommend that you check them out. That's part of the program that I was part of for my professional training. They offer a master's degree at Arizona State University as well. Another thing to check out around systems thinking is the Academy of Systems Change. Comes out of Donella Meadows' thinking, the work that she was doing at MIT. So that's another place to kind of start your systems thinking journey. And check that out. And then the last one I'll leave you with is the Behavior Design Academy. That's a decent place to start to get your head around some of the basic behavior design principles and biases and heuristics that are out there that we use as designers. And there's, all of these, there's a much deeper world that you can get into around them. So I'll kind of close with this. I believe as designers that we have a responsibility to design this way, for our children, for us, for the future as a species, for the planet. I think it's the only way that we can move forward in a well-adapted way, in a regenerative way that allows us to kind of stick around the planet a little bit longer and maybe not destroy very much more than we already have. So thanks for your time and have an awesome day.